Good morning, everyone. I'm Ruth Ennis, and I'm the Dementia Trials Manager in the Cognitive Clinical Trials Unit in Tallaght University Hospital. I started working in clinical research almost 8 years ago, and 6 of those years have been coordinating and managing dementia trials, and more specifically, investigational trials for Alzheimer's disease. I hope I can pass on some of my experiences and knowledge in this session today. Next. I'll be covering trial management and coordination as part of my presentation. The key points to always remember are adherence to protocol, importance of safety, integrity of data, and conduct of trial are paramount when conducting any trial. The topics I'll be covering will include maintaining essential documents in the study site file, using study-specific data collection forms and data entry, scheduling participant study visits, recording vital signs and ECGs, administering participant memory assessments, taking pathology samples such as bloods and CSF, processing and shipment of biosamples, pharmacy and dispensing trial medication, arranging regular monitoring meetings, invoicing, and study closeout. Next. For those of you who haven't previously participated in trials, there are lots of documents that will need to be filed in the investigator site file, often referred to as the ISF. I'm going to go through a number of these and why they are important. As Lara mentioned earlier, a CV will be required for the principal investigator and every member of staff participating in the trial, which needs to be signed and dated. This is to show that each study team member for the trial is qualified by education, training, experience, and expertise to conduct the clinical investigation of the specific drug being investigated. All CVs need to be updated every 2 years. For those being introduced to clinical research for the first time, GCP, or Good Clinical Practice, is the international ethical and scientific gold standard for designing, conducting, and reporting clinical trials. It includes ethical and quality requirements that must be adhered to for any clinical trial that involves people. GCP training is often provided in hospital sites where there is heavy involvement in clinical trials. Also, many trial sponsors will also provide links to online platforms providing this training. This training needs to be refreshed every 2 to 3 years. Subject enrollment logs need to be completed for every subject that is screened for study eligibility, whether they are randomized or not. This helps to keep track of the screen failures and the reasons behind this. It is quite common for changes to be made to the protocol or other trial documents after they've received regulatory or HPRA and ethics approval. These are referred to as protocol amendments. These amendments should include the likes of new study dose information, change in study cohort sample size, change to inclusion/exclusion criteria, adverse events or serious adverse events, protocol design change. After the protocol amendment has been approved, all updated documents relating to this amendment will need to be added in the site file, replacing the previous versions. All initial ethics and HPRA approval letters should be filed in the site file, as well as any updated approvals, which usually result from protocol amendments as mentioned above. The delegation log provides a comprehensive list of study staff members and the duties that they have been delegated by the principal investigator. Only those entered on the log may complete trial-related activities, only those for which they have been assigned. Training logs will need to be completed for all trial staff members to confirm that they have attended the site initiation visit and they are fully trained on the study protocol and any changes that may have been made to the protocol over the course of the study. This is usually requiring a sign-off by the study monitor. Next. I've included a sample study flowchart to give an idea of what a study visit might look like. So I'll just run through some of the points that are noted here. So usually what's required is documentation of concomitant medications, documentation of adverse events, a tablet count to verify compliance with the study treatment, check vital signs such as heart rate, blood pressure, weight, taking blood samples, urinalysis may or may not be required. And then at certain visits, and maybe only if clinically indicated, we may do a physical exam, a resting 12-lead ECG, memory assessments or questionnaires, and then imaging or lumbar puncture. Now, these are usually done as part of the screening. However, we did have a previous study where we had requirements for an MRI and a lumbar puncture at the beginning, middle, and end of the study. So this sample flowchart mentions things like cardiac surveillance. This is just due to the nature of that specific study drug for that trial. However, most of our studies wouldn't require these additional checks. Also looking at things like efficacy assessments. This one here looks at ADAS-COG, ADCS-ADL, MMSE, CDR, MPI, which are the most commonly used assessments. CBIC is used for this study, but another study may not use this assessment at all. As you can see, there are breaks from these as well at certain visits, which will give participants a bit of a reprieve. Next. A lot of planning and coordination is required for participant study visits. Generally, it's confined to within the department, but sometimes you may need to liaise with other hospital departments or maybe imaging centres or external vendors. So it's important to build a good relationship with these guys, which will really help when it comes to booking appointment slots with them. Usually plan about a week or two in advance, depending on what's required of the visit. As much as a month may be needed if trying to arrange scans or procedures in other departments that are incredibly busy clinically. We like to give the patients a rough estimate of how long a study visit should take so they can prepare themselves. Also, we like to let them know what the visit will involve beforehand. Many of our patients dread the memory assessments, so it's a bit of a weight off them when they know that they don't have to have these on a particular visit. Remind the participant to return study drug or IMP at each visit, especially closer to the visit time. Check if they've had any new medications added to their schedule, or if they've been feeling unwell, had any adverse events or procedures since their last visit. Also check study medication compliance, take a tablet count when they're returning their study supply. If there are any issues here, we'll re-educate the patient on the importance of taking their medication regularly. Complete all the required study-related procedures. It's also important to record everything that occurred during the visit in the patient notes and medical records, study worksheets, and the online data capture platform. Next. The trial patient's data is managed on a number of different platforms. Unfortunately, each of these are all separate from one another, so they will all need separate specialized training on these platforms before access can be given to the site staff members. This can be quite time consuming, so make sure to factor this into your costs when discussing the study budget with the sponsor. The primary collection tool for all relevant patient information taken from their medical records is the Electronic Data Capture System, or EDC. The most commonly used of these would be Inform, Oracle, Rave. The primary data collected would be things like demography, medical history, vital signs, concomitant medications, and adverse events. There may be other data points depending on the sponsor requirements, maybe ECG data, time and date of PK sampling, time and date of last dose prior to this visit. Rating scales and memory assessment data collection used to be paper-based in the past, but now most of them are recorded digitally using specially adapted tablets provided by the sponsor. These are submitted separately to vendors such as Clinical Inc. or Signant Health, who are delegated by the sponsor, and they'll review and analyze the data on their behalf. More recently, ECG data is actually collected by a company called Clario ERT, and we've had a good few studies now where we've been using their services. So instead of using our machines within the hospital, we are provided with an ECG machine specifically for the study. This can sometimes get a bit frustrating if you have 2 or 3 studies that are using Clario at the same time. They'll send you a separate device for each trial, which is not ideal. You could have 2 or 3 ECG machines having to be stored in the office, and then also trying to remember which trial is which for which machine. MRI centres will generally only have access to the platform, the Clario platform, but they will upload the MRI and PET imaging themselves to Clario, and they'll have to do their own training as well in relation to this. Just to also mention that lab providers more recently require sites to have access to their own platform too. They tend to upload the lab results directly now onto this, and they send email notifications to site when reports are available for certain queries, and also to notify when lab kits are due to expire, which is quite helpful. New lab kits can also be ordered on this platform. Next. Vital signs are completed as per usual process and recorded in the patient chart or study worksheet, CRF. ECG, we either use a local device, as mentioned previously, or a trial vendor device, which is becoming more frequent now. So Clario ERT, as I mentioned, is our most commonly used specialist provider. The read may be transmitted digitally directly from the device using a local area network or an analog phone line. This is the preferred method by the vendor, or it can be uploaded to an SD card or a USB. In my own experience, this process has been difficult in the past for our site when trying to get connected through the LAN or analog line. So we actually prefer to use the USB transfer, but this may not be a problem for other sites, so keep that in mind. Once successfully set up, then a test ECG will be sent for review, and then they will kind of give the site the green light then at that point. Next. So blood and/or urine samples are generally collected at every study visit. Though we do have a current study that doesn't collect urine at each visit throughout the study, but then we've had previous studies that did, so it's very much study dependent. The sample collection will begin at screening, and this is to assess any possible safety elements that may arise from these results that may exclude a patient from the study. Hematology, biochemistry, PK samples will be most consistently collected over the course of the study. So, every visit or every second visit. But most usually it's PK samples collected every second visit, depending on the specific protocol. Biological samples for future research analysis, blood-based biomarkers, APOE genotyping is generally collected at baseline randomization visit. Then CSF samples may or may not be required depending on the study. We had a recent study where we collected CSF at the beginning, middle, and end of the study. And all the instructions for this collection and processing will be covered in the study-specific lab manual. Next. So most studies will require biosamples to be analysed by a central lab contracted by the study sponsor. These will need to be processed by the site and then shipped out to the central lab. Specific lab kits will be supplied by the lab vendor with all required equipment and materials for blood, CSF, urine sample collection and processing. The shipment materials should also be provided, and these are shipped out to the site prior to study start, usually before site initiation visit. We did have a study there recently where we were supposed to start a long time ago, so actually all our lab kits expired, so we've had to reorder them again, which is a little bit of a waste, but we have to make do. Instructions for processing biosamples can vary between labs, so also can the shipping instructions and requirements. Lab manuals will always be provided by the lab vendor with fully detailed instructions for sample processing and shipment. All the lab results, unless blinded, will be notified to study site following analysis, and this will come by email. Sometimes the results could come in the email, or we'd be notified, as I mentioned, on the platform where we can download those. Next. The use of a refrigerated centrifuge will be a requirement by most sponsors for processing bloods at site, even though there are only 1 or 2 samples maybe that need to be spun at a cool temperature overall. The site must also be able to store samples frozen, refrigerated, and at ambient temperatures. So access to a fridge, -20 and -70 freezers will be needed. Ambient samples will need to be shipped on day of sampling, as all central lab providers are generally based overseas. The frozen samples can often be stored for longer periods throughout the study, unless they're needed for safety assessments at screening, as I mentioned previously. When the time comes to be shipped, the courier will provide the dry ice for you, but this usually needs to be ordered 24 to 48 hours in advance, depending on the courier being used. Next. Use of the pharmacy department for clinical trials is generally the preferred option for storage of investigational medicinal product or IMP. However, some hospitals may not have a dedicated clinical trials team, or they may have a dedicated pharmacist who's only available on particular days or times for dispensing, so keep this in mind. Also, just to be aware that they usually have their own costs and charges to provide the service, but most sponsors will be expecting to be charged with these pharmacy fees. The pharmacy trials team can go through any practicalities of dispensing the trial drug and ensure feasibility following review of protocols. So they would need to take a good look at the drug formulation, storage requirements, and so on. The drug storage in a secure area. However, depending on the number of ongoing studies at a particular time, they may not have the storage capacity for maybe a refrigerated IMP, but plenty of space for the IMP stored at room temperature, or maybe vice versa. So, it's good to check in with them about this. Stock management, dispensing and control of IMP. daily monitoring of storage conditions and maintenance of temperature logs, procedures associated with trial completion, archiving of trial pharmacy documentation, and compliance with ICH GCP guidelines and local regulatory agency requirements and guidelines. Next. As I mentioned in my previous slide, the hospital pharmacy may not have a trials team or may not have the space or capacity for drug storage, or the site might just prefer not to use the pharmacy department. So if opting not to use pharmacy, it's important to note that a secure, controlled and monitored space is required. Storage capacity is there for the IMP, temperature monitor, which will be a requirement by the trial sponsor, and then the additional workload for site staff. Next. Some of the downsides of opting not to use pharmacy: there's no pharmacy oversight. So this, having the pharmacy there reduces medication dispensing errors. Storage space, so some trial medication can come in large bulky formats, like a long study over 2 or 3 years with a high number of patients require a lot more room and space that most offices just wouldn't have the capacity for. Temperature monitor required by the trial sponsors, so there's more work involved with daily temperature logs and management if there's any sort of temperature deviations for site. It's more difficult to arrange refrigerated IMP storage as well. Also, just to keep in mind as well, it could be difficult to take on a trial that requires a new IV drug setup that may need the use of the pharmacy aseptic unit. And then the additional workload for site staff, so, drug accountability logs, temperature logs, and so on. Next. IWRS, IXRS is an interactive clinical trial drug supply management system used to enroll and randomize patients on clinical trials. You may also hear it referred to as IVRS, IRT, or RTSM. They're all the same thing. It's used to enter patient information, blind patient information, randomize patients, and keep drug supplies organized for the trial. The pharmacy will also have access to this system, so they will get notified when they're running low on study medication, about the shipment of IMP, and when a patient has been randomized or dispensed new medication. So once a patient has been randomized, assignment of the study medication kits to each treatment group is randomly allocated to each participant using the above system. Special ID or DUN numbers are allocated to every pack of trial medication. So before the pharmacy can dispense study IMP, they will require a prescription signed by the PI and a copy of the email confirmation sent from IXRS. The DUN or ID numbers will be noted on both the prescription and email confirmation to make extra certain of correct allocation. Next. So each study will have their own specific requirements for taking the study medication, especially those that may not have their study partner living with them or who might live alone. It'd be important to go over these instructions frequently with this patient population, as you may need to repeat these over the first few visits after starting the study drug. Some trials will have very specific requirements on taking the medication, such as one we had recently where it must be taken first thing in the morning, 30 minutes before their other medication, and food with only a tiny amount of water. So these can often require a little bit of discussion with the families as to how best to ensure compliance. Some studies may require a dose to be taken before or after PK sampling, so keep an eye out for these. One study we had required a study tablet not to be taken before they came in on 1 or 2 particular visits throughout the trial, so you have to give them like a proper heads up beforehand, like whether it's a call the day before, just to remind them of this. Also be aware of dose escalations. So a number of studies when a patient is started on a lower dose at the start, and this has been gradually increased over a number of weeks or months. We must strongly nail in the importance of returning the study medication at every visit as well, but it's especially important for dose escalation, so we ensure that the patient has actually been taking the correct dose at the correct time. We had a recent case where we didn't get the returns from a patient, and we advised their partner that they must be put aside and the new treatment started the next day. It was only after we were informed about an adverse event a few weeks later, when trying to nail down when it actually started, did it come to light that they had actually continued to finish the older pack and then started the new one. And this was probably a week or 2 later. So this also links into the importance of having a really good study partner who's able to carefully follow important trial-related instructions like these and who's reliable. It's also really important to note that all used and unused IMP must be returned at each visit in their original packs and pouches. The pharmacy and site staff can have a very difficult time linking which boxes have been returned if some of the external packaging has been removed, because these hold the DUN or the ID numbers, and these could be torn off or discarded, and it can happen quite often. Next. So arranging monitoring meetings. So each site will be visited at regular intervals by a study monitor throughout the course of the trial. So these visits ensure protocol adherence, quality of data by reviewing all source documentation, the subject records, lab reports, imaging reports, and so on, and the data entered in the EDC. Drug accountability and compliance checked, compliance with regulatory requirements, safety assessment and follow-up of safety issues, and then continued adequacy of the site and its facilities. Next. So some common findings during monitoring visits. There could be delays in data entry. Each study will have a specific time frame when they want data to be entered. So it could be anything from 48 hours to 5 days allowance. And again, this will be very much study specific. The same goes for the time frame when they want data queries to be answered and resolved. The missing data from the EDC, there could be input errors, data entered may be different from what's noted in the source documents. So it's their job to check these out. And then for informed consent form errors, a few of these most common errors would be the wrong version being used. Maybe a study partner mightn't have signed in the right section. A date may be missing. The signature could be in the wrong place, or patient initials are required. They may have ticked the boxes instead. Next. Invoicing arrangements are usually agreed with the study sponsor prior to study start. They may provide this information and details in the contract, which one sponsor very nicely did previously. However, not all will do this. Once a site has been activated, site setup fees can usually be invoiced to the sponsor. The general rule of thumb is when invoicing for patient visits and/or study-specific procedures, it's generally every 3 months, though some sponsors may only be happy to do invoicing every 6 months. If at all possible, when it comes to using external imaging providers or other external vendors, which we have had to do on a number of occasions, try to get the sponsor to arrange a separate contract with that centre where they can make payment directly. It becomes much more difficult and time-consuming when a site has to arrange these additional payments themselves. Some sponsors will give a set payment for each patient per visit. Others will require invoicing, so you may need to keep track of patient expenses, in particular parking ticket costs and mileage for those travelling a good distance. Some hospitals may have the facility to offer meal vouchers for refreshments in the hospital restaurant or canteen, or reimburse parking tickets, which is also a great system to have. They may even have petty cash handy. A more recent option for sponsors is the use of Scout, which is like a credit card. So this is loaded or topped up by the sponsor prior to each patient study visit. Any concerns with invoices, mostly the CRA or the study monitor will be able to help with arranging this for sites. Next. So the study will be closed at site when the trial has either reached its designated conclusion or been terminated prematurely. All study-related activities must be appropriately reconciled, recorded and reported at the end of the study period. All final visits must be completed by study participants, all data collection up to date and any outstanding queries answered. Any follow-up monitoring visits should be completed. Next.